I always liked hiking alone and camping in quiet places far away from noise and everything that reminded me of the city. I worked long hours and days blurred together, and when things became too heavy, I always packed my backpack, loaded my car, and headed out to whatever location seemed far enough from everyone. That was what I did that weekend. I chose a large forest that stretched across many miles. Not popular. No real tourist paths. Nothing fancy. Just raw land, trees, old logging roads, and silence. I reached the entrance in late afternoon, parked my car close to a tree line, locked everything, carried my backpack, and started walking deeper into the woods. The air felt clean, and there was something relaxing about each step I took. Branches cracked under my boots, birds moved from tree to tree, and the sky felt wide even though I was surrounded by trees. I walked for hours before I finally settled on a place that felt right. It was a small clearing with flat ground and a gentle slope nearby for drainage. I dropped my backpack, stretched, and started setting up my tent. I laid out my sleeping bag and foam mat, and when the tent was ready, I sat down, ate a simple meal, and enjoyed the cool air. The sun was dropping quickly, and the temperature fell with it. When darkness came in full, the forest changed. I turned off my headlamp to conserve battery and sat in the silence. I could hear insects, wind moving through branches, and the occasional distant sound of something moving through leaves. It was all normal. I had camped many times before and knew that forests made noise even when nothing dangerous was around. I wasn't worried. I eventually crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a single snap of something dry under weight. I listened for a long time. Nothing followed. I tried to ignore it. Forest animals moved at night all the time. I closed my eyes again and tried to go back to sleep. After a few minutes, I heard another sound, this time slightly closer. It wasn't big enough to be something huge like a bear, but it wasn't small either. I stayed still and breathed slowly, trying not to make noise. Eventually, the sound faded and I forced myself to sleep again. I woke up early in the morning. The sun was rising, the sky turning pale above treetops. I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. Nothing unusual. I ate breakfast, packed up a small day pack, and went exploring, leaving my camp set up since I planned to return for the night. I walked deeper into the woods, following faint animal paths, crossing fallen logs, brushing through tall ferns and undergrowth. I tried to capture some pictures, but my phone barely had signal. I kept walking anyway, enjoying the calm feeling that came whenever I was far from everything human-made. After a few hours, I turned around to head back. While walking, I noticed something odd. A tree I didn't remember seeing before had a small strip of red cloth tied around it. I hadn't gone this way the night before. I stopped and looked around. The cloth was old, faded, dusty, and torn, not something recently placed. Maybe an old hunting marker, I thought. I kept walking, but in the corner of my eye, I noticed more pieces of cloth tied to other trees farther ahead. Something about it made me uneasy. I didn't know who put them there or for what reason. I walked faster. When I returned to my campsite, I froze for a moment. My backpack, which I had left under a log to keep it out of the sun, had been moved. It was not robbed. Nothing was missing, but it had definitely been moved from where I left it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself I had simply remembered wrong. Campers sometimes misremember where they put things. I told myself that was what happened. I took a deep breath, sat down, forced myself to relax, and heated lunch. After eating, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for tracks or signs of disturbance. I wasn't a professional tracker, but I could tell when something obvious had stepped near camp. The ground was firm and covered in thick scattered leaves. I found nothing clear. Still, the unease stayed with me, like someone had stood near my belongings while I was miles away and simply looked at my things. I decided I would camp one more night and then leave the next morning. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and keeping my mind busy. The sun dropped and shadows stretched between tree trunks. I lit a small fire and sat close to it, feeling the warmth against the growing cold. The moon wasn't bright, and the forest slowly sank into darkness. The fire crackled gently, and I stared at it longer than I meant to, letting myself drift mentally, letting the flames keep me grounded. When the fire dimmed, I crawled into my tent again and zipped everything closed. I lay there, listening to the quiet. It was peaceful for a long time. Then I heard something again. Not an animal. This sound was deliberate. Slow steps through leaves, cautious, steady, approaching. I held my breath and stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the clearing. I strained to listen, every muscle tense. I wanted to look out, but I didn't want to make noise. I kept still, breathing shallow. Minutes passed. Silence returned. I thought whoever or whatever it was had gone. Slowly, I shifted inside the sleeping bag, trying not to rustle. Then I heard another sound, low, dragging through brush, very close. I stared at the tent wall, knowing someone or something stood just outside in the dark. My pulse pounded. I waited, hardly breathing. The sound stopped again. I didn't move. I lay awake for hours, listening, until exhaustion finally made my eyes close. When daylight finally filtered in, I opened the tent and stepped outside. My stomach sank. Signs of someone had been there. A partial footprint on the slope near the tree line, pressed into soft earth where there had been dew. Not boots, not hiking shoes, something flat, smooth, almost like a thin rubber sole. Not an animal. Human. I stood there, staring at the footprint, realizing I had not imagined the footsteps. I packed camp slowly, thinking through everything logically. Someone was out there, probably another hiker or hunter who had gone off trail. But the footprint was close. Too close. Someone had approached my tent while I slept. I felt exposed standing in the open clearing. I packed everything quickly, swallowed a dry breakfast bar, and slung my backpack on. I wanted out of the forest. I began the long walk back toward my car. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Each sound sharpened my nerves. At points I stopped, scanned the trees, listened. Sometimes I thought I heard something behind me, faint steps matching mine from a distance. But every time I turned, I saw no one. Just endless trees, shadows, and the false sense of being alone. I pushed on. After about 2 hours, I stopped to catch my breath and drink water. I took off my pack, sat on a fallen log, and tried to listen calmly. That was when I noticed something small on the ground a few feet away. A piece of fabric. A strip of faded red cloth, just like the ones tied around the trees. My throat tightened. The cloth had not been there when I passed earlier. Someone must have dropped or placed it while I was walking deeper in. I stood up slowly, looked around, saw nothing but the forest watching back. I forced myself to keep moving. The walk out felt much longer than the walk in. My shoulders hurt from the pack. My knees ached from stepping over roots and rocks. I tried to convince myself nobody was following me. I tried to calm myself by repeating that I was alone. But the feeling never left. Something was wrong. A few miles from the trailhead, I noticed flattened grass beside the faint path. A place where someone had stood or crouched recently. The shape was clearly human-sized. It faced the direction I had come from, like someone waited there, watching the trail. The forest felt too quiet. Even the birds seemed silent. I walked faster. After another bend in the old road, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves under weight. Far behind me, but close enough to confirm that I was not alone. I didn't look back. I just moved faster. My breathing became heavy. Sweat ran down my back, and my hands shook. I imagined someone following slowly, not rushing, confident they would catch up eventually. When I finally reached the last stretch toward the parking area, I almost cried from relief. The trees began to thin, the forest floor sloped upward, and sunlight increased. I practically jogged the last few hundred yards. I saw my car through the branches. The sight steadied me. I reached it, dropped my pack, opened the door, threw everything inside, and got in. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine started. I immediately locked the doors. As I pulled away, I looked into the rearview mirror at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure far back between the trunks standing still. Couldn't make out details. It might have been imagination, light, or something else, but it made my blood run cold. I turned my eyes back to the road and drove away without stopping. I drove until the forest was far behind me. I stopped at a gas station 20 miles down the road. I went into the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared into the mirror. I looked different, tired, drawn, slightly pale. The experience hit me all at once. Someone had been out there, walking near my camp at night, moving through the trees without speaking, leaving cloth markers, approaching me while I slept. I didn't know their reason, and I didn't want to know. The idea that they might have been watching longer than I realized made me feel sick. I sat in my car for a long time, engine off, just listening to the noise of the highway. Something normal, something human. I told myself I was safe now. No one was following. Nothing supernatural had happened. Just another person in the woods with motives I would never understand. After that day, I never returned to that forest. I continued camping, but I became more careful. I chose places with other people nearby. I learned to watch for signs, small clues that someone else might be around. I learned to trust the feeling in my gut when something in the woods felt different, because I knew firsthand how quickly peace could turn into fear. The ending was simple and real. Nothing followed me home. Nobody tried to contact me. There was no dramatic discovery, no news story, no closure tied with a bow. I survived because I trusted the fear and acted before anything worse happened. Whoever was in that forest that night stayed there. I never went back to find out who they were or what they wanted, and I never will. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It was the first real break I had taken from work in nearly a year, and the thought of being deep in the forest, away from roads, phones, and people, felt like a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. I found a small cabin for rent, tucked into a narrow valley far from the nearest town. The owner had said the nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the nearest grocery store was more than an hour's drive. That alone sounded perfect. I packed my car with what I thought I would need: sleeping bag, blankets, a small stove, canned food, bottled water, first aid supplies, and some basic tools. I also brought my camera, not for anything special, just to document the trip and maybe take some pictures of the forest if I had the energy to explore. The drive in was long and narrow, the roads becoming dirt and gravel as I went deeper into the mountains. I passed 1 or 2 small clearings with old cabins, abandoned or unused, their wooden walls weathered and cracked. There were no cars, no people walking around. The silence on the drive-in felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching. The cabin was small, a single room with a loft for sleeping. It had a wood-burning stove, a small sink, and a table with 2 chairs. The walls were rough timber, and the windows were thick glass, streaked with years of rain and dust. It smelled faintly of old wood and damp earth. Outside, the forest pressed close, tall pines and oaks that blocked most of the view beyond 100 feet. I parked my car close to the porch and unloaded my supplies. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains when I finished, leaving shadows stretching across the clearing in strange, jagged shapes. I started a fire in the stove, fed it slowly, and set my canned beans and some water on it to warm. The sound of the flames was comforting, and the heat pushed back the chill of the evening. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and watched the shadows through the window. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, no animals that I could hear. I chalked it up to the late hour and my own nerves. Night came quickly. I had no electricity, only the small light from a battery lantern, and even that seemed dim in the thick darkness that pressed against the cabin walls. I slept lightly, waking often to creaks and groans as the wooden structure settled. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, moving around the edge of the cabin. I froze, listening. They stopped as suddenly as they started. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. My heart was pounding when I finally convinced myself to lie back down. The next day, I explored the forest a little. The trees were dense, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. I found a small creek and followed it upstream for a while. The forest was beautiful, but there was a constant feeling of being watched. Even when I could see no one, the sense of presence was heavy. I returned to the cabin before nightfall, thinking it was safer to stay close now that I was alone. That night, I was certain I had heard someone moving outside again. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, circling the cabin. I got up quietly and peered through the window. Shadows moved between the trees, too big and deliberate to be animals. I grabbed a flashlight, slowly stepped outside, and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No sign of anyone. My heart was racing, and my palms were sweaty. I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next day, the unease grew. I decided to gather more firewood, carrying it from the edge of the clearing. Each time I looked up from the pile, I felt eyes on me. Branches snapped faintly behind me, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. The forest had that same heavy, quiet tension, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I told myself to stay rational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just beyond the edge of the clearing. By the second night, I had started hearing more than footsteps. There were noises I couldn't explain. A scraping along the walls of the cabin, faint thumps from the roof, rustling in the underbrush that didn't sound like animals. I stayed close to the fire, trying to keep my mind busy, but sleep was impossible. The wind picked up in the night, rattling the windows and making the shadows dance. I imagined someone could be watching from outside, studying me, waiting. My nerves were raw. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the cabin. I found footprints in the dirt around the clearing. They were boot prints, heavy and deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze, trying to make sense of it. The prints didn't match mine, and I was certain no one else was supposed to be here. Panic rose in my chest, but I tried to calm myself. I photographed the prints, examined them, and traced them back into the forest. They disappeared after a few dozen feet, as if whoever left them had vanished into the trees. I decided to pack up my things and leave immediately. The sense of being hunted, of someone watching and waiting, was too strong. I moved quickly, gathering all my supplies and loading them into the car. As I closed the trunk, I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure, tall and still, barely visible among the trees. I froze. My hands shook as I got into the car, started the engine, and drove slowly at first, then faster as adrenaline took over. I kept my eyes on the shadows, scanning for movement. The figure never moved again, never disappeared. It was like a frozen statue in the woods, and I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every sound, branches snapping, wind rustling, distant animal calls, made me flinch. I refused to stop until I reached a town, a place with people, lights, and cars. I stayed there overnight in a motel, sleeping with the lights on. I called the cabin owner the next day to explain what had happened. He was surprised but not entirely shocked. He told me he had heard rumors of people camping or staying in the area being watched by someone, though no one could confirm it. I never went back to the cabin. The sense of being watched, the footprints, the figure in the trees, all left a mark on me. I learned to respect the isolation of the forest in a way I hadn't before. It wasn't magical or supernatural, but it was terrifying because it was real, because there were people out there, or at least someone willing to observe and maybe stalk without leaving clear traces. It changed how I viewed solitude. I realized that the wilderness can be dangerous, not from monsters, but from other people. I carry that memory with me, always cautious, always aware that being alone somewhere far from help can quickly turn dangerous. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The forest I chose was remote, almost untouched, a place most people would drive past without a second thought. I wanted isolation, quiet, a chance to be completely alone with the sounds of nature. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, food, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, a headlamp, a multi-tool, and a solid map of the area. I checked everything twice. I wasn't reckless. I wanted adventure, yes, but I wanted it on my own terms. The hike to my chosen campsite took longer than I expected. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth, overgrown and muddy from recent rain. Each step required careful planning. The forest was dense, trees packed so tightly that sunlight barely touched the ground, leaving the floor in a permanent state of shadow. I noticed immediately how quiet it was. Not peaceful, exactly, but heavy, almost tense. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just a faint rustle in the underbrush that could have been the wind or something else. My heart raced a little, but I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I arrived at a small clearing by late afternoon. The spot was perfect. Flat ground, high enough to avoid flooding if it rained, surrounded by thick trees for shelter. I unpacked my gear, setting up the tent carefully, making sure the pegs were solid in the soft, damp earth. I built a small fire pit from stones I found nearby and stacked firewood within reach. The sun was sinking, and the forest's shadows grew longer and darker. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I blamed it on the cold and damp air. As I gathered kindling, I heard a distant crack of a branch breaking. I froze, scanning the forest edges. Nothing moved. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound had been deliberate, sharp, like a branch snapping under the weight of a human foot. I shook it off. I was alone and I wanted to stay that way. I told myself I had imagined it. By the time I got the fire started, the sun was gone, swallowed by the forest canopy. Darkness pressed in from all sides. The fire crackled, small and fragile, but it was warmth, light, and comfort. I ate a quick meal of canned food warmed over the fire and then cleaned up, storing the remaining food carefully. I didn't want any wildlife to be attracted. Every rustle made me tense. Every snap of a twig sent my heart hammering. Hours passed. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, listening intently to the forest. The wind stirred the trees, making them groan and whisper. I began to feel something I hadn't expected, a deep, gnawing unease. Alone in the dark, everything seemed amplified. A distant animal call sounded too close. Shadows between the trees looked like shapes moving. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm. Then I heard it again. Not an animal this time. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, soft, but distinct. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining it. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing visible. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around, the beam cutting through the blackness. Still nothing. The footsteps continued, circling, faint but persistent. Panic threatened to rise, but I forced myself to stay still, listening, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. I realized I was not near any other trail, not near any road. Whoever was out there had to be walking through dense undergrowth to reach me. The thought hit me hard. I was not alone, and they had probably been watching me for a while. My hands shook as I checked my multi-tool. I had a knife strapped to my belt. I wasn't armed beyond that. My mind raced with possibilities, all terrifying. I knew staying outside by the fire was dangerous. I zipped the tent and crawled inside, trying to be quiet. My flashlight illuminated the small interior, the shadows of the tent walls dancing as I held my breath, straining to hear anything outside. The footsteps continued, circling the perimeter, crunching leaves and twigs. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the person, or people, moving, slow, careful, testing my resolve. I waited, holding my breath, thinking about what I could do. I realized my best option was to leave quietly, move away from the clearing under the cover of darkness. But the forest was dense. Without a trail, moving silently would be nearly impossible. Every step I took would give me away. My mind went through scenarios, each one worse than the last. I thought of climbing a tree, but the branches weren't close enough to the ground to reach safely. Staying in the tent seemed equally dangerous. If they found me, I had no way to defend myself. Hours passed. I could hear the breathing outside, slow, controlled, deliberate. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting, testing me, The forest felt alive in a new, hostile way. I stayed as still as possible, trying to make myself blend into the darkness, hoping they would leave. I could hear small animals scurrying, reacting to the intruder's presence. As night deepened, the footsteps eventually faded. I waited long after they disappeared, my ears straining for any sign of movement. I was frozen, exhausted, and tense, unsure if it was safe to leave or even breathe. The first hint of dawn brought relief. I slipped out of the tent, checking every angle. No one was in sight. Nothing. My heart still raced, but I allowed myself to move, slowly packing up my gear, keeping my senses alert. By the time I reached the edge of the forest where I could see the road, my relief was immense. I was shaken, drained, and scared, but I had made it. I realized the forest could be beautiful, serene, and peaceful, but also completely unforgiving and dangerous when you're alone and unprepared. I drove home slowly, checking the rearview mirror constantly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. That experience changed how I approached nature. I continued camping, but never alone. I learned to respect the isolation, the power of being out in the wild, and the fact that not all danger comes from animals or the environment. Sometimes it comes from another human. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly control can slip away in the dark. From that trip onward, I always made sure to tell someone my exact route, to carry a phone with signal boosters to keep my gear accessible and ready. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch brings back the memory of that night, but it also taught me something invaluable. Preparation, caution, and awareness are the only tools that can keep you truly safe when the forest becomes a testing ground. And even though it was terrifying, it also made me appreciate the wilderness in a new way. It's alive, it's unpredictable, and it demands respect, not just from nature, but from everything that shares it with you. I always thought camping alone in the mountains would be peaceful. I imagined a quiet night away from the busy world, a slow evening with a small fire, the sound of leaves moving in the wind, and a chance to feel like I still had some control over my own life. I had gotten tired of work, tired of city noise, and tired of constantly feeling like I was surrounded by people but not actually connected to anything. Camping seemed like the only thing that could clear the noise in my head. So I packed my bag, loaded my car early in the morning, and drove toward a national forest several hours away from town. I chose a remote location far from designated campsites, an area with very little foot traffic. I liked the idea of being alone and not hearing other campers nearby. The forest road leading in was narrow and uneven, filled with stones and deep tire ruts that looked like they formed after years of heavy rains. It gave the feeling of entering a place that was rarely visited, a place where silence had existed for longer than I could imagine. I parked in a small opening just wide enough for the vehicle, stepped outside, and smelled the cool air. It had the scent of wet soil, pine, and something older that I couldn't describe. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of distant streams. It was the kind of silence that made you realize how loud your everyday life normally was. I locked the car, slung on my pack, and started toward the ridge line. The hike wasn't difficult, but the trail looked rough and wild. Fallen branches, moss that had grown thick on rotting logs, and small dents in the ground from animal tracks. I walked slowly, trying not to rush, marking the details so that I could find my way back if anything went wrong. After 2 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing that looked perfect for a camp. The grass was flat but slightly damp. The trees around the perimeter formed a natural wall that blocked most outside wind. I set down my pack, rolled out my small tent, and began setting it up. The forest still felt dead silent. No cracking branches in the distance, no calls from birds, nothing moving. The stillness was starting to feel less peaceful and more like something was paying attention. I built a fire pit using flat stones I found nearby. It took time, but I wanted something safe that wouldn't spread if the fire grew stronger during the night. I collected dry sticks and wood, stacking them carefully beside the pit. Sweat ran down my neck and my shirt clung to my back. The effort helped keep me calm, helped me push away a growing unease that I was trying not to think about. Eventually, I lit the fire. The flames rose, glowing orange against the dark green of the surrounding trees. The sound of crackling would finally broke the silence and gave the area a sense of normalcy. I drank water, ate a simple meal, and sat there watching the shadows shift around me as the fire popped and snapped. Time passed. The sky turned from light blue to deep navy. The forest became pitch black, the kind of black where even the trees disappeared if I turned my eyes away from the fire. The temperature dropped fast, and I pulled on an extra layer. The fire was small but warm. I stared into the flames and tried to let the heat relax me, but the feeling of being watched kept creeping back into my mind. It wasn't paranoia at first. It was a slow pressure building in the back of my skull, like my senses were trying to tell me something before logic caught up. My ears strained for sound. My body stayed tense without me realizing it. My hands felt cold even though I was directly beside a fire. Still, I refused to admit to myself that anything was wrong. I reminded myself that animals lived in forests. Deer, maybe wild boar, maybe a fox. They were always around, and my nerves were just reacting to the isolation. But after a while, I realized the silence wasn't natural. A forest at night should have something. Small noises, twigs snapping somewhere, wind moving leaves, even distant owls. But there was nothing. It felt like the world was holding its breath. My shoulders tightened. I kept my eyes on the tree line. The light from the fire didn't stretch far. I could only see a few meters beyond the glow, and everything outside that small circle of light looked like a silent black ocean. I told myself to ignore it. I forced myself to stand and stretch, then placed another piece of wood into the fire. The flames shot higher and spilled more light across the clearing. I kept moving, not wanting to sit still. But then the first sound came. Not loud, not sudden, just the faintest snapping of something in the forest, like a foot settling naturally on a branch. I froze in place. I listened, but the sound didn't come again. My heart was beating harder now. I felt the weight of the darkness beyond the fire. Not just darkness, but an emptiness, like something was standing there, just out of sight, thinking. My throat was dry. I swallowed silently and sat back down. I tried to convince myself it was nothing but animals moving through the brush. But there was something about the sound that didn't feel random. It wasn't the cracking of a branch under a running animal's foot. It felt gentle, careful, slow, like something that understood how not to draw attention. I tried to act normal. I sat still, staring at the flames. Minutes passed, and I finally started to relax. But then came another sound. This time it wasn't a snap. It was the faint movement of leaves, like a weight brushing lightly along a bush. It came from the same side of the forest as before. I exhaled slowly and looked toward the sound. Nothing but blackness. Not even the faint outline of trees. I leaned forward slightly, trying to focus my eyes, but everything melted together into the same empty night. I told myself to stand up again, not to look weak or afraid, even if it was just an animal. I walked toward the edge of the firelight, but I stopped before walking into the darkness. I knew that once I stepped beyond that line, my eyes would be useless, and anything out there would see me before I saw it. I swallowed. The cold air made my teeth tighten, and my breath left a faint mist in front of me. I stood like that for a long moment before turning back and sitting beside the fire again, putting another piece of wood onto the flames. The uneasy silence returned. I sat there, watching the flickering orange glow, and wondered why I suddenly didn't feel like I was camping for relaxation anymore. I felt like I had walked into something's territory without knowing. Time passed slowly. I checked my watch. The hands showed just after midnight. I realized I was exhausted, and maybe if I slept the feeling would pass. I kicked dirt around the edges of the fire ring, making sure it wouldn't spread, then crawled into my tent. My sleeping bag was warm, and the floor under me felt uneven and damp. I tried to close my eyes, but I couldn't stop listening. Every tiny sound, or the absence of sound, became louder in my head. I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly. My body finally relaxed and started slipping into sleep. Then another sound came. This time it wasn't branches or leaves. It was the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps on soil, slow, moving along the edge of my camp. Not rushing, not panicked, just casual, steady steps circling my tent. My eyes shot open, my pulse hit my throat. I lay completely still, ears wide open, every muscle frozen. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, trying to pick up whether whatever approached was breathing or moving again. Nothing came, no sound, just silence again, deeper than before. I lay still for what felt like forever. Then slowly, very slowly, I sat up, unzipped the sleeping bag, and reached for the flashlight beside me. My fingers shook slightly. I pressed the power button, and a narrow beam of white light filled the tent. I knew stepping outside might make things worse, but staying inside without knowing what was out there was worse for my mind. I opened the tent flap just enough and aimed the flashlight outside. Nothing. The clearing looked empty. The trees stood motionless. The fire burned low but still warm. I stepped outside, shining the light in every direction. The ground around the tent looked normal. No footprints on the surface that I could see. The night looked as still as earlier, but the feeling was still there, that pressure around me, like invisible attention pressing onto my back. I put more wood on the fire and sat beside it again, flashlight in hand. Sleeping now was impossible. I stared into the darkness for a long time, trying to ignore the growing ache in my stomach. The forest remained silent, but what came next was worse. Far off in the trees, something made a sound. Not an animal call, not human, not supernatural, just the low, muffled sound of something heavy dropping to the forest floor. A log? A dead branch falling? I wasn't sure, but it was loud enough that the trees absorbed the sound and let the echo ripple outward. I kept staring. The sound didn't repeat, but whatever caused it was big, heavy enough to make the ground vibrate faintly under me. I felt a wave of cold slide across my skin. I didn't know how long I sat like that, but eventually the fire died down enough that the clearing darkened again. I fed more wood into it slowly, shaking slightly, knowing that once the fire died completely, the darkness would swallow everything, and whatever had been moving out there would have the advantage. Hours passed like that, me staring into the forest, barely moving. Eventually the sky began to lighten. The shapes of trees slowly appeared as shadows turned into objects. Dawn crawled in and the forest finally changed. Birds began making sound again. A breeze passed through the leaves. The world returned, as if whatever had been watching only existed in the darkness. The relief that washed over me was intense. I felt my muscles loosening for the first time in hours. I had survived the night, but I wasn't staying. I put out the fire completely, packed my gear quickly, and scanned the campsite one last time. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach sink. About 5 meters from where I had set the tent, in an area of soft soil, were faint impressions in the dirt, large, wide, and shaped like footprints. Human-shaped, but wider, heavier, as if someone large had stood there for a long time during the night, watching and waiting. The prints led into the tree line and disappeared in the undergrowth. No other tracks, just a quiet trail into the dark forest. My chest tightened. I stared at the prints for a long moment. I wondered how long the thing, person or not, had been standing there. I wondered if it had been studying me or deciding whether to approach the tent. I wondered if my firelight had been the only thing that kept it from crossing into the clearing. I didn't waste more time. I turned and hiked back toward the car faster than I ever had before. The forest looked normal now, full of sounds and movement, but none of it eased the thought that something had been close to me in the night, watching me breathe in my tent. When I reached the car, I unlocked it with shaking hands, threw my pack inside, and closed the door. The engine turned over, and I left that mountain road, dust trailing behind me as if I was running from something I never saw. The rest of the day felt unreal. Back on paved roads, seeing other cars, passing towns, hearing normal life moving around me. It all felt like a world far removed from that silent darkness. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, the careful footsteps circling the camp, the heavy thud from deep in the woods, and the footprints in the soil. I didn't tell anyone what happened because there was nothing to prove. No photos, no evidence, just my memory, my fear, and the knowledge that something had been close enough to touch me in the night. But the part that still bothers me is simple. A normal animal does not move that quietly. A normal animal does not make no sound for hours. A normal animal does not stand silently 5 meters from a tent without ever approaching. And a normal person has no reason to stand in the woods all night without speaking, without showing themselves, without making their presence known. Whatever it was had patience, calmness, intent. It had watched me and made a decision. It had chosen not to act. But I still think about how close I came to the possibility that it could have chosen differently. And that is the part that scares me the most. I always liked camping alone because it gave me space away from everything in my life. No noise from work, no traffic sounds, no random interruptions, just the open forest, the sound of wind in the trees, and the quiet that you never really notice until you are far away from cities and houses. I never thought something as simple as a quiet camping trip could turn into the most frightening night of my life. But that is exactly what happened. And even now, after so many months have passed, I can still feel the fear in my chest when I think about it. I can still smell the cold air of that night and hear the tiny sounds from the woods that I used to ignore, the ones that only became important when I realized how close real danger was. I went camping in late September. The weather was just starting to change, with warm afternoons but cold nights. I drove about 4 hours into a national forest that was not extremely popular, which was perfect for me. I didn't want other people around, didn't want to hear voices or see tents or smell someone else's campfire. I wanted to be alone, and I chose an area where most people did not go because the road was rough and required a high vehicle to reach safely. I had checked my car carefully, made sure I had fuel, supplies, emergency gear, and everything that I needed to stay out there for 2 days. My plan was simple. Arrive in the afternoon, hike around, set up camp, cook dinner, sleep, and then explore the deeper part of the forest the next morning. The drive alone set the mood. The farther I went, the less I saw signs of people. No houses, no fences, no fresh tire marks. Nothing except long dirt roads that cut through thick layers of forest on both sides. The trees looked older in that area, bigger than the ones I usually saw. Some had trunks so wide that one person could not wrap both arms around them. The road was rough, covered with stones and ruts from seasons of rain. I could imagine the place being nearly impossible to reach in bad weather. The forest was quiet in a way that city people don't understand. It wasn't silent. There were birds, insects, and the occasional whisper of branches moving, but it was natural silence, not the artificial quiet of rooms and walls. I remember rolling down the window and breathing the cold air, enjoying that feeling of isolation, that feeling of being far away from normal life. When I finally reached the place I had marked on my map, I stopped the car in a small clearing with enough open space to pitch a tent comfortably. There was no sign of other campers. No footprints, no fire rings, no litter, nothing. It looked untouched, and I liked that. I got out, stretched my legs, and looked around. The trees circled the clearing like walls. The sunlight came through in thin, straight lines that hit the ground like warm beams. The smell of sap, dirt, and pine needles filled the air, and I remember thinking that it was perfect. I unloaded my gear, set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and organized everything carefully because I liked order, even in the woods. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and ate while listening to the sounds around me. The forest noises were calming, steady, and familiar. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere far away. I spent the rest of the daylight hiking around the area, not far from camp, but far enough to feel like I was exploring. I took pictures of moss-covered rocks, animal tracks, and old fallen logs. I even followed a small shallow stream for a while. The water was clear, and the bottom was covered with smooth stones that glittered underwater. I crouched beside it, splashed my face, and felt refreshed. I didn't see any large animals, just birds and a squirrel that climbed a tree with surprising speed. That day felt calm, peaceful, and ordinary. When I walked back to camp, The sun was already low, and the shadow of the trees grew longer. I could see my tent through the branches as I approached, sitting still and quiet in the middle of the clearing. Watching it from a distance, I had no idea that later, when darkness came, that same quiet tent would feel more like a small, helpless bubble in the middle of something huge and uncaring. As the sun set, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit a campfire and sat close to it, warming my hands and legs. I cooked a simple can of beans and ate while listening to the night come alive. The sound of insects changed. The birds went silent, and the air grew heavier. The forest seemed to breathe, not in a mystical way, but in a real physical sense. When the wind blew, the trees exhaled. When the wind stopped, everything waited. I looked up at the sky and saw more stars than I ever saw at home. The fire crackled and popped, throwing sparks that floated upward and disappeared. I sat there for hours, writing in a small notebook, reviewing my hiking route for the next morning, and enjoying the warmth. When the fire burned low, I poured water over it slowly and stirred the ashes until everything was black and cool. I packed my food away, put anything with a scent into a container, and stored it away from the tent in case animals came near. I felt confident, calm, and ready to sleep. I slid into my sleeping bag inside the tent, zipped it up, and turned off my small lantern. The tent was dark, but I could still see the faint glow of moonlight on the fabric. The ground was cold, but the sleeping bag kept me warm. I lay there listening to the forest outside. First, everything was normal. Night insects, faint wind, and the ordinary shifting of trees. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. I thought I would fall asleep quickly, but something kept me awake. Not fear, just awareness. When you sleep indoors, you get used to background noise, but in the woods, every sound has meaning. A crunch of leaves might be a raccoon, or it might be something bigger. A snap of a branch might be wind, or it might be something walking. Because of that, my brain stayed awake longer than usual, listening automatically. Then something changed. Far away, I heard a sound that stood out from the rest. A steady, repeated noise, like something walking through dry leaves. It was slow, measured, and heavy, not the quick, light movement of a small animal. I stayed still, breathing quietly. I tried to judge direction, but it was difficult in the dark. The sound continued for several seconds, then stopped completely. The forest went quiet afterward, almost too quiet. The insects seemed to lower their noise. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just the wind making a branch fall, but deep inside, something felt off. My instincts had picked up something before my mind could name it. Something about the rhythm of the steps felt intentional. Not random, not like an animal wandering, more like something moving with purpose. I lay awake listening for a long time, and slowly the forest returned to normal noises. After maybe 20 minutes, my body relaxed, and I drifted into sleep. I have no idea how long I slept before I woke again. The tent was still dark. The air felt even colder. My breath made soft clouds that faded quickly. What woke me was a sound that I could never forget. A single sharp crack, like a heavy stick snapping under weight, not far from the tent. I lay absolutely still. This time, the sound wasn't far away. It was close, too close. I listened carefully. The footsteps came again. Slow, deliberate, crushing dried leaves and twigs, one at a time with long gaps in between. They were not the fast steps of an animal moving around on all fours. These sounded spaced apart, as if something was walking upright. Each step came closer, and my heartbeat sped up. I felt my palms get sweaty even in the cold. I didn't move a muscle. The steps stopped again, but I could still hear something. Breathing, very faint but real. Slow, controlled breathing. Someone was outside my tent. Not an animal, person. And I was deep in the forest miles from the nearest road, alone with no other campers nearby. At that moment, fear became physical. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It sat in my stomach like a weight, making me dizzy. I wished I could see through the tent wall, but I couldn't. I wished I had a weapon in my hand, but my small camping knife was in my backpack near my feet. I didn't want to move even an inch to grab it because I didn't want anything outside to hear movement. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe a lost hiker stumbled into camp. Maybe someone living off the grid was passing through. Maybe it was something worse, someone who didn't want to be seen. I didn't know, and not knowing was the most terrifying part. The breathing sound continued for several seconds, then stopped. I listened harder, straining my ears until the muscles in my neck ached. I couldn't hear anything now. No steps, no movement, nothing. Just silence. I didn't know if the person was still outside or gone. I didn't know if they were standing right next to the tent quietly listening, or if they had moved back into the trees. I stayed frozen, hardly even breathing. After what felt like forever, I slowly, silently reached for my backpack inside the tent and slid it toward me. My fingers felt clumsy as I found the small knife and wrapped my hand around it. It was small, meant for preparing food, not defending myself. Still, holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe longer. I could not tell because time moved strangely when every second felt important. Eventually, the forest returned to its natural sound. Insects chirped again. The trees rustled. A faint breeze moved across the clearing. It almost felt normal again. My body was exhausted from tension, and despite the fear, my eyes grew heavy. At some point, I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep, still holding the knife pressed against my chest. I didn't sleep deeply, just slipped in and out while remaining aware of the cold and the quiet. The next time I woke, it was morning. Pale light pushed through the tent walls. My body felt stiff from stress and lack of proper sleep. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. The clearing was empty. Nothing seemed disturbed. The ground looked normal. My food container was still in the same place I left it. There were no footprints that I could see, but the forest floor was covered with thick leaves and pine needles, so tracking anything would be difficult unless the ground was soft. Still, everything looked peaceful, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had been half asleep and dreamed the footsteps, but the tight feeling in my chest and the memory of that heavy breathing told me it had been real. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, scanning the ground and the area between the trees. I felt someone had been there. I couldn't prove it with evidence, but instincts are not always wrong. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was probably just a hunter or a hiker passing through in the dark. People make strange choices sometimes. Maybe they had seen the glow of my fire and checked who was camping there. I tried to normalize it in my mind, but the idea still bothered me. If it had been an innocent passerby, why had they stood silently instead of calling out? Why walk so slowly and carefully? Why stand close enough for me to hear breathing? I drank water, ate a granola bar, and packed a few things for a short hike. I told myself that fresh air and movement would calm my nerves. I left the tent and most of my gear behind, planning to walk along the stream I saw the previous day. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more open. Sunlight broke through the branches in wide beams. Birds sang normally again. My fear slowly faded into the background. I walked for hours, exploring deeper into the woods, taking pictures and trying to enjoy the day. I reached a rocky area where trees thinned out and climbed to a small overlook with a view of endless forest in every direction. I sat there for a while eating trail mix and listening to the wind. On the way back to camp, however, the uneasiness returned. I couldn't explain why. Nothing specific happened. No sound, no movement, just a sudden wave of instinct that something was off. I stopped walking and listened. The forest was not completely silent, but something about the sounds felt different. It reminded me of the moment before a storm, when the air feels heavy and watchful. I continued walking, a little faster now, wanting to get back to camp and make sure everything was where I left it. As I got closer, I slowed my steps automatically, eyes scanning the clearing ahead. My tent was still there. My backpack was still leaning against a log. But something was different. The small stack of firewood I had collected the night before had been disturbed. Some pieces were moved and scattered. I stood still, staring at it for a long time. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I was tired the previous night, but not careless. I always kept things organized. Something had been at my camp while I was gone. At first, I thought maybe an animal had knocked things around, but the logs looked like they had been moved by hands, not claws. A few leaves were cleared to the side, like someone had crouched there. I felt my heartbeat picking up again. Someone had come back. Someone had been at my tent while I was deep in the forest, unaware and unprotected. Suddenly, the peaceful forest no longer felt warm and natural. Felt like something was watching. The air seemed colder, even though the sun was out. I walked toward my tent slowly, checking everything around me, listening for any sound. Nothing moved. I crouched near the disturbed logs and studied the ground. I found faint impressions, not clear footprints but shallow marks where weight had pressed down. Still not proof, but enough for my instincts to feel justified. My chest tightened. I realized that if someone was stalking me, they could have harmed me already but chose not to. That was terrifying in a new and worse way. It meant they were in control, choosing the timing, watching silently. I stood up, trying to think logically. I had two choices: pack up and leave immediately or stay one more night as planned and hope nothing worse happened. I should have left, but part of me didn't want to feel forced out of the forest by fear. I also told myself that maybe I was overreacting. Sometimes the brain builds something bigger than reality when fear is involved. I tried to calm myself, took deep breaths, and decided to stay. Looking back now, it was the wrong decision. If I had left then, everything would have ended differently. But I stayed, and darkness would return again, bringing something far worse than footsteps in the night. I decided to go camping alone in the early autumn season when the weather was still warm in the day but cold at night. I picked a place deep inside a large forest area that was several hours away from the nearest small town. I wanted silence, nature, peace, and a full break from everything. I packed everything I needed, including a tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, a folding chair, a flashlight, spare batteries, a hunting knife, and a journal. The road leading toward the forest was old and cracked, with sections covered in dried mud from past rains. The trees grew thick on both sides, branches sticking out like arms reaching over the road and turning the afternoon sunlight into broken patches moving on the windshield. I drove slower the deeper I went because the road became less taken care of. Fallen branches were everywhere, and the gravel looked washed away. The forest felt old in a heavy way, like it had been there long before people lived anywhere near it. There were no houses, no farms, no power lines after a certain point. Only the sound of the vehicle, the wind through trees, and the occasional bird or insect. When I finally reached the small dirt clearing that I had marked on an old map, I stopped the car, turned off the engine, and rolled the window down. I sat there for a moment listening. The whole world felt still. I could hear the ticking sound of the engine cooling down, a few birds somewhere far above, and nothing else. No traffic, no voices, no hum of city life, only nature. I climbed out and stretched. My legs were stiff from the long drive. I looked around slowly to get the first full feel of the place. The sky was bright, clear blue with a few long white clouds drifting slowly. The trees around the clearing were tall and thick, many with rough gray bark and branches so high they looked like wooden ceilings. The ground had a mix of dirt, pine needles, dry leaves, and small stones. The smell was strong with pine, soil, and dried vegetation. I unloaded the gear from the car slowly and set up the tent on a flat piece of ground that looked firm enough. I hammered the stakes deep into the earth so that the tent would stand solid even if the wind picked up. I unrolled my sleeping bag and laid it inside, along with a small pillow and flashlight just in case I needed it during the night. After that, I took a walk around to explore before it got too late. I walked slowly through the trees, making sure I took note of landmarks so I would not get lost. I found a small stream about 5 minutes walk from my campsite. The water was clear and moving gently, making a soft running sound against the stones. I crouched and dipped my fingers in. The water was icy cold, felt refreshing, almost sharp against the skin. I decided I would stay near the stream for the evening since it was peaceful. and the sound of water flowing helped calm my mind. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on a fallen log. I ate slowly, staring into the fire as the sun went down behind the trees. The shadows grew longer and darker until the light disappeared completely. The sky above turned deep blue, then black, with stars slowly appearing. No moon at first, so the darkness took over quickly. The forest changed sound as night arrived. Daytime sounds like birds and insects faded away. New sounds took over. Distant snapping branches, rustling leaves, and occasional calls of animals that I could not see. The night forest had a lonely, heavy atmosphere. I listened carefully, trying to identify everything, but I could not. Sometimes sounds felt far away, sometimes too close. The darkness made everything more intense. I eventually put out the fire, returned to my tent, and zipped it shut. I crawled into my sleeping bag and laid there on my back listening. The ground felt cold under me, even through the sleeping pad. The fabric of the tent made small crackling noises whenever the wind touched it. I stared into the darkness, feeling tired but awake at the same time. I expected to fall asleep easily because of the long day, but my mind stayed alert for some reason. After about an hour of lying there, I began to hear something. It was faint at first, like a slow dragging sound across the ground outside. The kind of sound made by something heavy moving over dried leaves and dirt. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I waited. Then it came again, much clearer, like something or someone walking but slowly, dragging one foot lightly. I reminded myself that animals walked around at night all the time. Deer, wild boar, maybe a wandering dog or coyote. So I stayed still and tried to slow my breathing. But then I heard another sound that made my entire body tense. It sounded like a slow exhale. Not loud, not deep, but clear, like someone letting air out of their nose in the cold night. It was maybe 30 feet away. My heart beat fast and I tried to stay logical. Could be an animal breathing, maybe a deer. They sometimes make nose sounds like that. I told myself that, but my body did not relax. I lay there completely still, muscles tight, listening for the next sound. For a few minutes, there was nothing, only cold silence. Then a sudden metallic click echoed from outside, close to where the car was parked. I recognized it instantly. It sounded like someone brushing against the metal of the vehicle door handle. At that moment, all thoughts of animals left my mind. No animal touches a car door like that. My pulse felt like it filled my ears. I slowly sat up in the sleeping bag and listened even harder. Something was moving outside. The steps were very slow, almost like the person or thing moving was being careful not to make sound but failing anyway because of leaves and sticks breaking under each movement. I reached slowly for the flashlight next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I did not want to give away that I was awake and listening. I thought of calling out, but then I remembered I was alone, deep in the woods, far from any help. If someone was out there, calling out might only make things worse. I stayed sitting there for almost half an hour, breathing slowly, waiting, listening. Eventually the sounds faded away. No more steps, no more breathing, nothing touching the car, only silence. I did not sleep for a very long time. I lay back down but kept my eyes wide open, staring into the dark fabric above me. My muscles stayed tight, and every small sound made me lift my head. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion took over and I finally drifted off. When I woke up, it was already bright outside. Birds were singing, and sunlight was coming through the tent wall. I sat up, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The cold morning air hit me immediately. The forest looked very calm and beautiful in daylight. I walked over to the car and checked it. Nothing looked wrong. No marks, no scratches, nothing moved. I walked around the campsite slowly but did not see tracks that clearly looked human. The ground was covered in old dried leaves, so footprints would not show clearly anyway. Part of me wondered if I had imagined everything. Maybe I was tired, maybe the sounds were animals, maybe the handle sound came from something falling. But I did not fully believe that. Something had felt too real, too close, too controlled. I decided to stay for another night anyway. I had planned 2 nights of camping, and I didn't want fear to make decisions for me. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. I followed a narrow trail that looked barely used. The trees grew even denser in that direction, making the light dimmer even in the afternoon. The air was still and heavy. I didn't see any other hikers, not even signs of people like wrappers, footprints, or cut branches. It felt like a place no one walked for a long time. During the hike, I found something strange. A large tree with a wide trunk had deep marks cut into the bark. The marks looked like they came from a blade or sharp tool, not from claws or animals. The cuts formed long crude lines going down the tree. Not letters, not symbols, but the kind of mark someone would make if they were hacking the tree repeatedly for no purpose. The tree looked scarred, old, and abused. I touched the cuts, and the wood inside was dry. They had been there for months or years. I felt a strange cold feeling in my stomach. Not physical cold, but emotional. Something about the marks felt wrong, aimless, disturbing. I continued walking but became more aware of my surroundings. I looked around more often, listened more carefully, and kept one hand near the hunting knife on my belt. I walked a little more until I came across something else. A small old campsite. There was a collapsed tent frame, torn fabric stuck under branches, rusted metal stakes on the ground, and an old burned circle where a fire once was. Moss and plants had grown over most of it. No one had used the spot for a very long time. But what made my stomach tighten again was a dented metal water bottle laying half buried in soil. It had deep dents as if someone hit it hard multiple times. The dirt around it looked undisturbed, meaning those dents were old. Something violent had happened here. I stood silently, breathing slow, staring at the scene. The forest felt completely still again, like yesterday. Too still. I had a rising instinct that I should not stay long. I decided to return to my own campsite before the sun dropped too low. The hike back felt different. I kept turning around, feeling watched although I saw nothing. The sound of distant branches breaking returned. Maybe animals, maybe not. When I got back to my site, I took extra time preparing for the night. I gathered more firewood, checked my flashlight batteries, placed the hunting knife inside the tent next to where I would lie, and decided to keep a small lantern lit inside all night. I cooked a meal as the sun set, but my appetite was smaller. The sky darkened again, the colors fading from orange to red to purple and finally black. The night came fast. The forest sounds changed again just like before. Silence covered almost everything. I sat outside in the dark for a while, the fire burning. The silence felt heavier than last night. The wind barely moved the branches. The air was cold and still. I looked around slowly, scanning the tree line with my eyes. Nothing moved. No rustling. No insects buzzing near my ears. Too quiet. I put out the fire, zipped myself inside the tent, and sat with my back against the wall of it. I left the lantern burning and stared at the light patterns on the tent fabric. I breathed slowly, trying to relax. Time passed slowly. I listened and waited. About an hour later, I heard it again. The dragging step sound. But this time it was closer than before. My heartbeat jumped. I sat completely still, not even swallowing for a moment. The steps moved slowly, circling somewhere outside the tent. Leaves and small sticks cracked softly under weight. I gripped the knife handle. The steps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then came the breathing noise again. The same slow exhale. But this time it was right outside the tent wall. No more than 2 or 3 feet away from me. I could hear the air leaving lungs. Cold, controlled, human. My skin tightened and a wave of cold panic moved through my body. I kept sitting perfectly still, trying not to shake. Whoever or whatever was outside knew I was there. They were inches away. No talking, no animal sounds, no attempts to run away, just silent, patient breathing. The figure stayed outside for at least a full minute, maybe more. Then I heard leaves shift as they slowly stepped away. I listened to the fading sound. Then silence returned again. I sat awake until sunrise, gripping the knife, sweating even though the night air was cold. Every small sound made me jump. When daylight appeared and the darkness faded, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. About 20 feet away, The dirt and leaves showed an unmistakable footprint. A human boot print. Not fresh enough to show perfect detail, but fresh enough to be from last night. My blood ran cold. I checked around the campsite again and found another boot print near where my car was parked. The realization settled hard in my chest. Someone was coming here at night. Someone walking around the campsite. Someone close enough to breathe against the tent wall. And whoever it was, they did not try to speak, did not try to steal, did not run away, did not ask for help. They only watched. I packed up quickly. I did not cook breakfast. I barely drank water. I kept the knife in hand while taking down the tent. My hands shook slightly, but I focused on moving fast. The entire time I felt like eyes were on me. The forest was silent again. Too silent. I kept turning around, checking the tree line. I loaded everything into the car, slammed the doors shut, turned the engine on, and drove away fast, trying not to look in the mirrors too much. When I reached the old cracked road again and saw sunlight open onto it, some of the weight in my chest lifted, but not fully. I didn't slow down until I reached the small town 3 hours away. I parked in front of a gas station and sat in the car, breathing slowly, letting the tension drain out of my body. I looked in the rearview mirror at my face and saw how pale and tired I looked. I had not slept properly since the first night. For days afterward, I kept thinking about the breathing sound right outside the tent, the slow steps, the car handle, the old destroyed camp I found, the cuts in the tree, the silence of the forest, the footprints near the tent. I don't know who was there. I don't know how long they had been watching me before I heard them. I don't know if they intended to hurt me or if they enjoyed scaring anyone unlucky enough to camp deep enough in that forgotten forest. All I knew with complete clarity was that I had left at the right time. If I stayed another night, maybe things would have gone very differently. Maybe I would have woken up to something staring at me through the tent fabric. Or maybe I would not have woken up at all. After returning home, I stopped camping alone for a very long time. Every time I think of sleeping outside in the woods again, I remember that cold, controlled breathing inches from where I lay, the feeling of being watched in total darkness, and the knowledge that the forest, in its silence, does not always hide animals. Sometimes it hides people. People who wait. People who watch. People who do not leave footprints in the morning unless they want to be seen. And knowing that is enough to still make me wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, listening carefully, checking the darkness around me, breathing quietly, just in case something is there. Taking slow steps on dried leaves, stopping only a few feet away, waiting for me to breathe loud enough for them to hear. I always enjoyed being alone in nature. I liked the silence, the fresh air, and the feeling of being far away from the life that was always full of noise, pressure, and people. Going camping alone was something I did often, and I always felt safe doing it. I never thought of danger in a serious way. I had been doing it for years without any major problems. Most nights in the forest felt peaceful, calming, and quiet, and for a long time I believed nothing could go wrong as long as I stayed alert and followed safety rules. The camping trip I went on that week was in late autumn. The weather was colder than usual, and the days were short. I chose a remote camping spot in a forest area far from towns and far from the main road. I liked places where not many hikers went. It made the experience feel more personal. When I arrived, I parked my vehicle beside a dirt road, put on my backpack, and walked deep into the woods. The air smelled sharp and clean, and the ground was covered in brown leaves that broke softly under my boots. I could hear nothing except the wind passing through the branches and the sound of my steps. For most people, that silence would be frightening, but to me it felt like a break from everything in my life. After about an hour of walking, I found the place I wanted to camp. It was a flat, open space surrounded by tall trees. There were no signs of other campers, no empty cans, no fire pits, nothing. I liked that. I liked knowing that I was alone. I set down my bag, took out my small tent, and started preparing the place before the sun went down. The temperature was dropping slowly, but it was still comfortable enough to work without gloves. I collected dry sticks and wood for a fire, then cleared leaves and small branches from the ground where I would sleep. When the tent was finally up, I sat down, drank some water, and looked around. The forest felt still. No birds, no animals moving. It felt like the entire area was holding its breath, waiting for something. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I had been in silent forests before. Sometimes wildlife moved deeper into the woods during the colder months. The evening came fast. I lit a fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames warmed my hands as I sat on a log and enjoyed the feeling of being away from everything. I could see the colors of the sunset through the branches. The sky slowly turned dark, and after a while, the area was lit only by the fire and my small lantern. When the night fully settled, I felt the cold bite at the back of my neck. I added more wood to the flames and sat closer. Usually nights on camping trips were the part one enjoyed most. Watching the fire, listening to distant nighttime sounds, and thinking about life made me feel calm. But that night, the silence was different. It was not peaceful. It felt heavy. Even the wind seemed to die down. The trees stood still like metal poles, and the air around me felt tight. I tried to ignore the feeling and focused on the burning wood. I told myself that this type of silence was normal in colder seasons. Animals moved less, insects disappeared, and the sound of running water from streams slowed as temperatures dropped. I convinced myself it was nothing unusual. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go inside the tent. I put the fire out properly, making sure no embers remained. I zipped up the tent and got into my sleeping bag. The tent was small but warm. My breath made light clouds inside. The floor had a layer of foam padding, and I stretched out, listening to the faint sound of leaves settling outside. Everything seemed calm enough, and after a long day of hiking, my body was tired. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up the first time. It must have been deep in the night. The forest was pitch black and soundless, and my eyes adjusted slowly. I didn't know what woke me at first, but I felt uneasy. The kind of unease that happens when something is wrong, even if your mind can't say what it is. I lay still, breathing quietly, trying to listen for anything. At first I heard nothing, but after about a minute I noticed a faint sound, like something large stepping on leaves, very slowly. My heartbeat increased, and I stared at the wall of the tent. I tried to remind myself that forests were full of animals. A deer, maybe a boar, could be anything. I listened harder. The steps were slow, deliberate, spaced apart. Not the kind of movement animals usually made. Wild animals moved quickly, shifting through bushes and branches. This sounded different, almost controlled. I stayed quiet, focusing my ears. The steps stopped, and I could hear nothing again. I waited, stiff, barely able to move because I didn't want to make a sound. After another minute of silence, I slowly relaxed. I tried to breathe normally again. I convinced myself it was probably a deer that got curious and then moved away. Eventually, I closed my eyes and tried to sleep again, though I kept thinking about the noise. An unknown amount of time passed. I drifted in and out of sleep. Then I woke again suddenly. This time there was a new sound, a softer one, like something brushing against the outside of the tent. I could feel the vibration through the thin fabric. My entire body froze. The brushing sound stopped quickly, but the pressure of adrenaline stayed strong in my chest. I felt exposed. The tent suddenly felt like a thin piece of paper offering no protection. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe a branch had moved from the wind. Maybe an animal sniffed around. But the wind was not blowing, and the brushing felt intentional. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I kept still, listening, hoping the sound would go away. Minutes passed with no more noise. Slowly, the fear settled back down, though it didn't leave completely. I stayed lying down, staring into the dark tent, unable to relax. Eventually, I forced myself to close my eyes again, though I didn't fall asleep fully. My thoughts kept drifting between fear and exhaustion. Sometime later, I heard another sound. This one was distant at first, like something a good distance away stepping on dry sticks. The steps were uneven, sometimes soft, sometimes louder. They grew closer and closer. I held my breath. The steps stopped again, not far from my camp. I felt the air change inside the tent. I was fully awake and terrified. I reached slowly into my bag and took out the flashlight. I held it in my hand without turning it on. I didn't want to make a sound or shine a light unless I had no choice. The forest outside was silent again. Too silent. No insects, no wind, no animal calls, just an empty darkness. After several minutes of stillness, I began to think maybe I imagined some of it. Sometimes when a person wakes up in a dark, cold place, the mind creates fear where it doesn't need to exist. I kept telling myself that. I tried to breathe slowly and calm myself. But then I heard something that shattered any illusion of safety. There was a new sound, a sound I was not ready for. It was not a step this time. It was the unmistakable sound of something metal clicking, not loud but sharp. It sounded like metal tapping lightly against metal. There was no reason for such a sound in the woods. No animal carried metal. That sound belonged to a human. My body filled with heat and fear at the same time. My muscles tensed. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My mind raced. I tried to think of any logical explanation, but nothing came. Nobody should be out here. There were no trails, no nearby camps, and no reason for someone to be walking through the forest in the middle of the night. I lay in the dark, listening. The metal sound stopped, and I heard nothing again for what felt like forever. My thoughts became darker. I imagined someone outside standing still, listening, watching my tent. The idea made the air inside feel even thinner. I knew I had my camping knife in the backpack near my feet, but reaching for it would make noise. I thought about turning on the flashlight, but shining light on the tent walls would show exactly where I was inside. I stayed frozen. After several long minutes, I heard new footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming closer, leaves crushing under weight. Each step felt like it landed directly on my chest. The sound approached the tent, and I braced every muscle in my body. I could hear the footsteps stop right outside. Just one thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was standing there. The fear was overwhelming. I waited for something to happen. The tent didn't move. I heard no breathing, no movement, just silence. I remained there, locked in terror. Eventually, I realized I had been holding my breath too long and slowly let air out through my nose. After what felt like endless minutes, the steps started again, but now they moved away. Slowly, gradually, until they faded into the distance. I kept listening, afraid they might return. But after a while, I heard nothing. No more metal, no more movement. The forest returned to the deep silence it had earlier. I didn't sleep again. I stayed awake in the tent for hours. My body was cold and stiff, but I didn't move. I waited for the sunrise, counting every minute in my head. Eventually, the faint blue light of morning appeared. I waited until the light grew strong enough before unzipping the tent. I stepped outside slowly. The cold air hit my face. The forest looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. Birds were moving in the branches now, making small sounds. The world seemed alive again. I checked the camp area carefully. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the ground near the edge of the trees. There were footprints, not animal tracks, human. The footprints were fresh, deep impressions in the soft dirt, leading toward my camp and then away again. I followed them slowly with my eyes. The tracks came from the deeper part of the forest, stopped only a few steps from my tent, and then turned back the same way they came. There were no other tracks. Whoever was out there approached, stood there, and then walked away again. Next, I noticed something else. On the ground was a small piece of metal, a broken piece from something. It looked like the end of a chain link. I picked it up and examined it. It was slightly rusted but still solid. There was no reason for something like that to be there unless someone dropped it. My stomach tightened. The fear I had felt in the night resurfaced. I realized I was not imagining anything. Someone had been out there. Someone was close enough to touch the tent. Someone who had metal on them. And they were moving without speaking, without using any light, and without trying to be heard, except for their careful steps. I packed up camp quickly. I checked my surroundings again before leaving. As I walked back through the forest, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound I heard made me tense. The wind blowing through dry branches, a bird landing on the ground, leaves moving under my boots. Everything felt like a threat. I moved faster than I had ever moved on a hike. I just wanted to reach the vehicle and get out. When I finally reached the dirt road, I felt a sense of relief, but it wasn't complete. The road was empty. The world was quiet again. I loaded my gear into the vehicle and took one last look at the forest behind me. In daylight, the trees looked normal, even peaceful. But I knew what had happened during the night. I knew someone had been walking through that forest with no light at 2 or 3 in the morning. Someone who approached a stranger's tent without speaking. Someone who waited silently outside, listening, watching. I drove away without wasting time. The farther I got from that place, the better I felt. When I reached a populated area, I finally relaxed my grip on the steering wheel. But the experience stayed in my mind. Even days later, when I was home, I kept thinking about it. I realized that danger in nature doesn't always come from animals or storms. Sometimes the real danger walks on 2 legs, moving silently through the dark woods. The thought that someone was out there, maybe living in the forest, maybe hiding from something, maybe watching hikers who camped alone, it changed the way I saw camping. For years, I felt safe in the wilderness, but after that night, I understood something clear. Sometimes the scariest thing in a dark forest is not what you imagine. It is the real person you never see, who stands only a few feet away while you sleep, and leaves before daylight without making a sound. I still camp, but I never camp alone anymore. The memory of that silent walker still stays with me every time I hear a branch snap in the distance at night. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, the kind where I could disappear from everything, carry nothing unnecessary, and just be alone in the woods for a few days. I had packed lightly: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, some dehydrated meals, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a small folding knife. I wanted to test myself, to experience that quiet intensity of being completely alone in nature, without anyone around to help me. The drive out of the city had been long, winding, and slowly liberating. I felt a tense sort of excitement, the type that makes your stomach twist, when you know you're heading into a place where there's no comfort, no cell phone signal, no immediate help. The trailhead was small, mostly just a gravel parking area surrounded by thick pine trees and the faint smell of wet earth. The forest looked untouched here, dense and dark under the heavy canopy. I strapped my pack onto my back, checked the map one last time, and started walking along the narrow trail. I could hear the dry crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant sound of a small creek. The woods were quiet in a way that made every sound feel magnified. A snapping branch somewhere off to my left made me pause and strain my eyes. Nothing. I continued, telling myself it was probably a deer or just a falling branch. I followed the trail for nearly 2 hours, the incline steepening as I went deeper. My legs were starting to feel the strain, my breath coming a little heavier than usual. I was watching for a flat spot to set up camp for the night. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, the light filtering through the tall pines became golden, then quickly faded to a muted gray as the shadows lengthened. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a shallow ridge. The ground was firm, covered with a thin layer of fallen needles, and just enough space for my tent. There was a small pile of stones nearby, probably from a previous camper who had made a fire. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure. My hands were slightly shaky, partly from fatigue, partly from the sudden realization that I was completely alone in the middle of a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. After setting up, I decided to explore the immediate area. A small stream trickled nearby, and I could hear the sound of water over rocks. I filled my water bottle and filtered it through a small portable filter. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, sharp and fresh, but there was also a faint, musky scent I couldn't immediately identify. The sun had almost vanished completely, and the forest darkened quickly. I went back to my tent, unpacked a small stove, and started heating some water for my dehydrated meal. The first bite of food was surprisingly satisfying after the long hike. The quiet was almost unbearable in the way that makes your mind fill the space with imagined sounds. A rustle in the trees here, a distant crack of a branch there. I told myself repeatedly that it was just the forest, that nothing was watching me. Night fell fully, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. I left the tent flap slightly open to let in fresh air, but just enough that I could see the faint outline of trees. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint but distinct sound of someone moving through the underbrush. It didn't sound like an animal. It was heavier, clumsier, the type of shuffle that comes from a human walking. My heart rate picked up instantly. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was there had noticed me. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other large animal. The rational part of my brain said I was safe. The irrational part wanted to bolt. I lay awake for hours, listening to every tiny sound. The wind through the pines, the water in the stream, the occasional snapping branch. By 3 a.m., I was exhausted and dozed off, but light sleep only, aware of every small noise. When I woke, it was still dark, just before dawn. My stomach tightened as I noticed the ground near my tent was disturbed. Footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were too large and too distinct. Someone had walked right by my tent in the night. I froze, scanning the trees. The prints led off toward the ridge, but I couldn't see anyone. My heart pounded, and I felt that icy fear that comes from realizing you are not alone in a place you thought was deserted. I quickly packed up my tent, shoved everything into my pack, and moved quietly toward the trail, trying to put distance between myself and whoever had been near my camp. My mind raced, thinking through what I could do. I had my knife, but it wasn't a weapon I could rely on against another human. I needed to get to the trailhead and back to my car. I hiked faster than before, my legs burning, my lungs gasping. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every rustle of leaves felt like someone following. I avoided stopping unless absolutely necessary, trying to keep my pace steady. The forest seemed different now, more menacing, as if it had noticed my fear. The birds weren't singing, the wind was almost still, and the usual comforting noises of nature were gone. The thought of being confronted by another person in these isolated woods sent chills down my spine. I reminded myself to stay calm, to keep rational. Whoever had been near my tent might not even still be in the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After nearly an hour of fast hiking, I reached a small ridge that gave me a view of part of the trail behind me. I paused, crouched low, and scanned the area. There was movement, 2 figures moving along the trail behind me, keeping a distance but clearly following. My stomach dropped. They weren't close enough to confront me immediately, but they were persistent. My mind raced. If I tried to outrun them, could I make it to the trailhead? Or should I try to hide and wait for daylight? I chose neither. I kept moving, using every tree and rock as cover, zigzagging to avoid being a predictable target. Hours passed like this, each step heavy with fear, every sense on high alert. My body ached, my throat was dry, and my energy was fading. I forced myself to eat a few bites of my trail mix and drink some water, but I couldn't stop moving for long. Eventually, I came to a creek crossing, shallow enough to wade through, and I took a chance. I slipped into the water, letting the sound of the creek mask my movement. I crossed carefully, knowing they might still be watching from the far side. When I climbed out, soaked to the knees, I glanced behind. They were gone, as if whatever was following me had abandoned the chase. The relief was temporary. My legs were exhausted, my body shaking from fear and cold water, but I pressed on. Finally, as the sun began to rise, I spotted the edge of the forest ahead, the gravel parking area, the trailhead, my car. I broke into a sprint, adrenaline giving me the last bit of energy I had. When I reached the clearing, I didn't stop until I had the keys in my hand and the doors locked. I sat in the car for several minutes, heart hammering, breathing ragged, making sure I was actually safe. No one appeared. No one followed. The experience left me shaken but alive. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily someone could have harmed me if they had intended to. But I also realized the importance of preparation, observation, and calm in extreme situations. I drove away slowly, glancing back at the forest one last time. It looked peaceful again, like nothing had happened, but I knew the truth. Nature itself was neutral. It was the people who sometimes made it dangerous. I never camped alone in a remote area again, at least not without telling someone exactly where I would be and when I would return. I still thought about those footsteps, that presence in the dark, but I was grateful I had escaped without confrontation. I had always believed that camping alone was something everyone should do at least once in life. I liked the silence, the space to think, and the feeling of being far away from the world. I picked a dense forest area several hours from the nearest town, a place where the trees were thick, the land was uneven, and the wildlife was loud at night. The sky was supposed to be clear, the weather predicted calm, and the trail was rarely used. That kind of isolation made the trip feel perfect. I carried enough food, water, and gear, and I felt confident I could handle myself. I had camped alone before, and nothing ever went wrong. That type of thinking was comfortable, and maybe that comfort was what caused everything that happened later. I parked my car at a small clearing with a dirt road that barely showed up on maps. The area had no signboards or markings, just a faded old metal gate that was unlocked and pushed open. I stepped out into the cool air, hearing nothing but birds and the soft rush of wind moving through the branches. It smelled like pine, dirt, and the start of winter. I loaded my backpack and took out my map. The forest looked simple on the paper, wide enough to get lost in but not big enough to be dangerous if I stayed aware. I planned to hike deep into the center and camp a short distance from a small river. I wanted space from everything else. Little did I know that getting space would be the last thing I ever wanted later. The hike took longer than expected. The map was old and the paths had changed. The ground was uneven with roots sticking up and rocks hidden under fallen leaves. I kept walking, checking the compass every now and then, making sure I stayed in the direction I intended. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods became. The air felt still in some places, like it had not moved in years. I saw old deer tracks, broken branches, and claw marks on tree trunks that looked like they came from bears. Nothing bothered me at first. Wildlife was normal. Nature had teeth, and I already understood that. I respected it. I reached the river after a few hours. The water was cold and fast, but shallow enough for small animals to cross. The bank was muddy, covered with fallen branches and layers of dead leaves. I found a small patch of level ground just above the river and set down my gear. I checked the trees for broken limbs, widowmakers, or signs of animal beds. Everything looked fine. I set up my tent close enough to hear the water. I liked that sound. It made the mind slow down. It prevented the silence from getting too heavy. I boiled water on a small camp stove and made a simple meal. The sun dropped lower, and the shadows stretched across the forest floor. I ate slowly while watching insects approach the stove light from the fading daylight. Everything felt calm, normal, and peaceful. I finished eating and cleaned up, making sure no scraps were left out to attract animals. I packed everything into sealed bags and placed them in a bear canister a short distance away from the tent. I sat outside, watching the sky turn darker, and for a long while I just listened. I heard the river, the wind, and occasional movement from small animals. Nothing felt dangerous. Not yet. As the night came fully, the forest changed. The air cooled, and the wildlife sounds changed from birds to insects and larger animals moving far in the distance. I crawled into the tent, zipped myself in, and lay down on my sleeping bag. I stared at the thin fabric above me, watching how shadows moved when branches outside swayed. I felt comfortable and safe. I thought nothing could go wrong, and even though I had read about bad things happening to people in remote places, it always felt like something that happened to someone else, never to me. I slept for several hours before something woke me. It was a distant sound, low and dull, like something heavy hitting the forest floor. I opened my eyes and listened. The river was still rushing. The wind was light. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it was footsteps. Not fast, not panicked, but slow and deliberate. Heavy enough to be a large animal, but the steps were spaced in a way that didn't feel right for something four-legged. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that hiking areas like this were sometimes used by hunters or rangers. But then I realized how far I had gone, and that I had not seen a single sign of another person all day. I had walked through land that seemed untouched for weeks or months. The steps got closer, then stopped. The silence felt heavier than the darkness around me. I held my breath. The footsteps started again, but now they were moving away. I could hear movement through the underbrush, then nothing. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. I told myself that whatever was out there had moved along and had no reason to come back. Eventually I drifted off again, but my sleep was lighter, full of small moments where I woke up thinking I heard something. When daylight came through the tent fabric, I sat up and stretched. The woods looked normal from the small opening of the tent. The ground was still covered with fallen leaves, dew shining on them. I stepped outside, checked the campsite, and looked for tracks. I found them quickly. They were footprints. Human. Large, deep, spaced apart like someone walking slowly. They passed near my tent and continued along the riverbank. I felt uneasy but tried to explain it logically. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone scouting or camping. If it was a person, they had walked past without bothering me. That should have calmed me, but it did not. Something about the distance of the nearest known trail made it feel wrong. Whoever made those footprints had come from deep in the woods, the same direction I would be heading later to explore. I drank water and packed a small bag to explore the area. I wanted to see more of the forest and find a better understanding of where I really was. I followed the river upstream. The ground got steeper, and the trees grew even closer together. I walked for miles, marking trees as I went, making sure I could find my way back. After some time, I found something unexpected. A small cabin sat hidden among the trees on a rise above the river. It looked old, older than the dirt road I came in on. The roof was missing shingles, the windows were covered with grime, and the door had once been painted red, though now only flakes remained. I stopped and stared. I felt like I had stumbled onto something that had been forgotten by everyone except time and weather. The clearing around it was overgrown with weeds, tall grass, and rusted pieces of metal. It looked like old hunting traps, broken folding chairs, tangled fishing line, and tools that had been left in the open until nature destroyed them. I approached slowly. The cabin had no sound coming from it. No smoke, no movement, no animals running out of sight. But something felt off. I walked around one side and looked at the ground. There were footprints, fresh. They led straight to the cabin door and then circled around the building, stopping near a broken window at the back. They matched the tracks near my tent. I studied them carefully. They were definitely human and fairly recent. The weight distribution showed that the person carried something heavy. Maybe a weapon, maybe gear, maybe something else. My heart beat harder. I felt watched even though I saw nobody and heard nothing. I did not go inside the cabin. Something in my mind told me not to. I backed away slowly and returned along the river. That feeling of being watched followed me the entire way back, even though I never heard footsteps behind me. Every sound of a twig snapping or a branch shifting made me stop and check. Nothing moved. The woods looked the same as before, but that only made the fear stronger. Back at the campsite, I tried to calm down. I boiled water, ate, and tried to act normal, but my thoughts kept returning to the cabin and the footprints. I replayed every detail in my head. Someone was living out here or spending time here without wanting to be found. The traps, the tools, and the discarded items around the cabin suggested survival, isolation, or maybe hiding. I thought about moving camp, but the woods were huge and the river was the only reliable landmark. Moving would not guarantee safety. I sat on the ground staring at the river for a long time, trying to think logically. I told myself that whoever was out here had no reason to bother me. They had passed by my tent during the night and continued on. The sun dropped behind the trees again, and the light faded. The sky turned darker faster than I wanted. My nerves were stretched tight. I did not like the idea of another night out there, but packing up and hiking back in the dark would be even worse. I sat outside as long as I could before finally climbing into the tent. I lay down but left my flashlight in my hand, knowing that sleep was going to be hard to come by. Darkness covered the forest completely. The river was the only sound. Even the wind was still that night. I closed my eyes, and for a long time nothing happened. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, and heavy. This time they were closer and approaching directly. My breathing got shallow. I could feel the cold weight of fear spreading through me. The steps stopped right outside the tent. The thin fabric separated me from whoever stood there. I held completely still. The person didn't move. I could hear their breathing, soft but heavy, and I felt my entire body freeze. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Felt like time stretched out without end. Then the person moved again, not away but around the tent. The footsteps circled slowly. I gripped the flashlight like it could protect me. When the steps reached the back of the tent, they stopped again. Then I heard another sound, something metallic snapping softly. It was like a trap being set or reset. I tried not to imagine what kind of trap. The person moved away after that, disappearing into the woods. I waited for the sound to fade completely before I exhaled. I stayed awake until morning. When daylight came, I crawled out and looked around. The ground showed fresh tracks circling the tent. They led up the river again. I followed them a short distance until I saw something chilling. A steel snare trap had been set just inside the tree line, hidden under leaves. The metal was clean, polished even. It was prepared with fresh tension, meaning it had been set only a few hours earlier. If I had walked through that area without seeing it, I could have been caught. The thought made my stomach twist. This was no ordinary hunter. Hunters did not walk around tents at night or set traps near where someone was sleeping. I realized then that I needed to leave immediately. I packed as fast as I could. My hands shook, and every sound made me turn around. I loaded my backpack and began walking back toward the direction of my car. The woods felt different in daylight, but the fear stayed. I kept moving fast, looking behind me often. My legs burned, but I did not stop. After some distance, the trees changed and the land sloped downward. I reached a part of the forest I did not recognize. The map did not match the surroundings. I had gone off course. I checked my compass and tried to correct, but the land kept pulling me away from where I needed to go. I walked for hours, sweating, breathing hard, and battling the growing feeling that I was being followed. Sometimes I heard sound behind me, branches shifting, leaves crunching lightly. When I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved, it returned. It was never close enough to see anything. That was somehow worse. At one point, I came across another trap. This one was different. A large pit covered by branches and leaves. Inside were old pieces of bone that looked like deer, maybe bear, maybe something else. The person who lived out here was an expert. They knew the land, knew how to track, and knew how to trap. I was the only one unprepared. I was the outsider on their ground. As the day dragged on, I found myself deep in unfamiliar territory. The sun was dropping lower again, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught in the dark. I pushed harder, ignoring the pain in my legs and the shaking in my chest. Finally, I saw something ahead. A dirt path. Not the one I had come in on, but a path nonetheless. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or clearing. It led somewhere else. At the end of the path was the same abandoned cabin I had found before. I had walked in a circle without knowing. The sight of that structure made my blood run cold. I realized then that whoever lived here wanted people to get lost. They had set traps, moved silently in the night, and watched from the shadows. I had probably been led without realizing it. I backed away from the cabin slowly, not taking my eyes off it. My instincts screamed at me to stay alert. I ran then, not a steady walk, not cautious hiking. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through undergrowth and snapping branches. The forest tore at my clothing, scratched my arms, and filled my mouth with dry air. I could hear my heartbeat louder than anything else. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept running. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from the cabin. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, and at the far end, I saw something familiar. My car. I had broken out of the maze of trees and reached the dirt road. My relief was overwhelming. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my bag into the back seat, and jumped inside. The keys were in my hand before I could process anything else. I started the engine and drove, dirt flying behind me. I did not look in the mirrors. I did not slow down until the forest was miles behind me. Only when I reached a gas station far from the woods did I stop. I got out of the car, legs trembling, and sat on the curb. I felt the weight of everything hit me. The footsteps, the traps, the cabin, the circles in the woods, the feeling of being watched. I had no proof of anything other than footprints and the memory of what happened. I thought about calling someone, reporting it, but I knew how it would sound. A remote forest, unknown land, no names, no faces, just a stranger living in isolation. Maybe the authorities would check, maybe they wouldn't. But I knew one thing for certain. Someone was still out there. Someone who walked the woods at night without fear. Someone who set traps with calm hands and waited. Someone who knew how to move silently, how to track, how to survive. Someone who had stood outside my tent in the dark while I lay inside, unable to move or breathe loudly. I never returned to that forest. I never camped alone again. I learned that the real world was far more frightening than anything imagined. There are people living in places where normal society never goes. People who do not want to be found. People whose land is not marked on any maps. And if you cross into their territory, you may not realize it until they are standing outside your tent in the darkness, breathing softly, listening to you be silent and afraid. I still think about that cabin sometimes, rotting in the trees, hidden from the world, with traps buried all around it. The person who lived there was real. Their footprints were real. The trap I saw near my tent was real. I think about what might have happened if I had taken one wrong step in the dark, if I had left the tent at the wrong time, if I had ignored my instincts and gone inside that cabin to explore. I think about how close danger was without me realizing it. In the end, nothing supernatural chased me. No ghost, no monster, no fantasy. Just a real person in a real place. Someone who lived in silence and darkness with skills sharpened by isolation. Someone who watched me while I slept. Someone who moved circles around me without making a sound. And that reality is far more terrifying than anything made of imagination. Because monsters in stories eventually disappear when the sun rises. But people like that stay long after daylight comes. And they are still out there. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the city, get away from the noise, the stress, and the endless pressure of work. I had been hiking and camping before, but this time I chose a more remote area, a national forest far from the nearest town. I had done some research, looked at maps, and found a small clearing near a river that was supposedly quiet and scenic. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, water, stove, some dried food, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries. I had a GPS device, but I also brought a map and a compass just in case. I thought I was prepared. The drive to the trailhead was long. The roads were narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I parked my car, double-checked my pack, and started down the trail. The path was overgrown in places, the dirt soft from recent rain. I followed the map closely, and the further I walked, the more I felt like I was truly alone. The feeling was thrilling at first, like being somewhere untouched and wild, but it was also a little unnerving. There were no other hikers, no footprints in the mud, nothing but the forest around me. After 2 hours, I reached the clearing I had planned to camp in. It was small but flat, with enough space for my tent. A river ran nearby, its water glinting in the late sun. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was stable on the slightly uneven ground. I cleared away rocks and sticks, flattened the surface inside, and pegged it down securely. I arranged my sleeping bag and gear inside, making sure everything I might need during the night was within reach. The forest was growing darker now, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. The river sound was soothing, almost hypnotic. I decided to start a small fire. I had brought dry kindling and fire starters. I built a small circle of stones, arranged twigs and branches, and managed to get a steady flame going. The smell of burning would mix with the earthy scent of wet soil and leaves. I cooked a simple meal, mostly dried vegetables and some protein bars, and ate slowly, listening to the forest around me. As darkness fell, I realized how quiet it was. The usual forest noises seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My flashlight cut through the blackness in a small circle, and I could see nothing beyond the glow. I decided to take a short walk along the river to explore before it got completely dark. I carried my flashlight and kept close to the path. The riverbank was slippery with mud, and I had to watch each step carefully. After about 20 minutes, I heard a rustling sound in the undergrowth behind me. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but then the sound was repeated, slower, deliberate, closer. My heart started to beat faster. I froze, shining my flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker now, heavier. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon, but the sound of twigs snapping underfoot made me nervous. I didn't linger. I turned back to my campsite, hurrying but trying not to trip on the uneven ground. Back at the tent, I checked all my gear. The fire was still burning low, so I fed it a few more twigs. I tried to focus on practical things, checking my water, making sure my knife and flashlight were within reach, but my mind kept drifting to that sound. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me back, or if it had, it was quiet now. I told myself the forest was full of noises at night, small animals moving about, wind shaking branches. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up to my chin, and tried to sleep. The sound of the river was supposed to be relaxing, but instead it reminded me of the isolation. Every small snap or rustle outside made me tense. Around midnight, I woke to a different sound. It wasn't the river, and it wasn't the usual night creatures. It was a low, dragging sound, like someone or something was moving through the forest floor near my campsite. I stayed completely still, listening. My flashlight lay on the ground next to me, too far to reach without getting up. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My stomach tightened. My first instinct was to hide inside the tent, but I also thought about safety. If someone was really out there and meant harm, they could see or hear me, but I wasn't sure what it was. I had told myself I was prepared, but now I realized I hadn't considered someone intentionally trying to scare me, or worse. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the clearing. For a moment, nothing. Then I saw a figure, crouched just beyond the firelight, moving slowly between the trees. My heart jumped. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, blending with the shadows. It didn't seem to notice me yet. My mind raced. I had a knife in my pocket, my phone in the tent. I needed a plan. I didn't want to run blindly, but I also didn't want to wait and see what the figure would do. I remembered the extra rope I had brought, meant for hanging gear. It could be used to make noise or defend myself. I grabbed it, holding it in my hands, trying to make myself small but ready. The figure started moving toward the river. I realized then that they weren't attacking. They were moving slowly, almost hesitating, glancing around like they were lost or looking for something. I waited, staying still, trying not to breathe too loudly. The sound of the river masked the faint movement. I debated my next step. I could stay put and hope they went away, or I could move toward the car, which was still a good distance down the trail. Moving in the dark could be dangerous, but staying put could be worse if the person wasn't alone. After a few minutes of tense silence, I decided to wait a little longer, hoping they would leave. I watched, barely blinking, as the shadowy figure disappeared behind the trees along the riverbank. By the time the sun started to rise, I hadn't heard or seen anything more. I was exhausted but relieved. I knew I couldn't stay another night in that clearing. I packed up my gear quickly, keeping my movements deliberate and careful. Every sound in the forest felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, a distant bird, even my own footsteps. I stayed alert, scanning for any sign of the figure from the night before. The trail back to the car felt longer than it did coming in, each step tense with uncertainty. I reached the car eventually, my legs shaking from adrenaline and fear. I locked the doors and sat for a few minutes, breathing deeply, waiting to calm down before starting the engine. Driving away, I kept thinking about how close it could have been and how unprepared I felt for a human threat in the wilderness. Even after I was home, the fear lingered. I kept imagining what could have happened if the figure had decided to approach or if they weren't alone. I realized then that the forest, no matter how beautiful and peaceful, could be dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. Human threats in the wilderness were real, and the quiet isolation that made camping so appealing could also be the most dangerous part. I learned the importance of staying vigilant, always letting someone know your location, and trusting instincts. After that experience, I never camped in a completely isolated spot without additional precautions. I invested in better safety gear, a GPS tracker, and made sure that someone always knew my exact route and expected return time. The fear I felt that night never fully went away, but it also taught me respect for both the wilderness and the unpredictability of other people. I still camp, still hike, but with careful planning, awareness, and an understanding that even a peaceful forest could hide real danger. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: disconnect from the city, sleep under the stars, and test my own limits. I had always loved the outdoors, but I had never ventured so far alone. I chose a remote camping area deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road, hoping to find silence, peace, and the kind of solitude that city life never allows. I packed carefully, checking and rechecking my gear. A sturdy tent, a heavy sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a small stove, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a couple of knives. I even carried a hatchet, which I justified as a precaution in case I needed to chop wood. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The thought of being completely alone in the wilderness thrilled me. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Mist clung to the ground, curling around tree trunks like smoke from a hidden fire. The path into the forest was narrow and rough, littered with fallen branches and slippery patches of moss. My boots crunched against dead leaves and broken twigs as I walked. The further I went, the quieter it became. Birds chirped intermittently, insects buzzed in the undergrowth, and somewhere far off, water gurgled. It was a comforting yet eerie kind of quiet, the kind that makes every small sound feel amplified. After hiking for about 4 hours, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for camping. The ground was flat, mostly free of rocks and roots, and a few large trees offered partial shelter from the wind. I started setting up my tent. I was meticulous in my work, making sure every peg was secure and the rainfly was taut. Once the tent was ready, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. It wasn't easy. The forest floor was damp in many places, and I had to search under piles of leaves and dead branches to find wood that wouldn't immediately smoke when lit. By the time I had enough for a small fire, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple. I lit the fire with care, using a small flint I carried. Flames crackled and hissed as the wood caught, sending small sparks into the air. I sat down, feeling the heat on my face, and let myself relax for a moment. I cooked a simple meal, nothing fancy, a can of beans and some instant noodles. Eating slowly, I listened to the forest around me. As darkness fell, shadows stretched and merged with the trees. The wind shifted occasionally, making the branches creak and groan. Every small sound seemed louder, every rustle in the undergrowth a potential threat. But I told myself it was just the forest, nothing more. I went to bed early. The night was colder than I had expected, and I huddled in my sleeping bag, grateful for its insulation. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the occasional snap of a branch, probably from some unseen animal moving in the darkness. Sleep came slowly. I kept waking up at odd intervals, convinced I heard movement near my tent. Every time I opened my eyes, everything looked the same. Darkness, shadowy trees, the faint glow of embers from my dying fire. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. I was alone. Nothing could harm me. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a branch breaking or a deer moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, soft, slow footsteps circling the edge of my clearing. I froze. My mind raced. There was no path near my campsite, no sign anyone should be here. Whoever it was, they had to have been following the forest trails, keeping hidden. I tried to make myself calm, telling myself it could be an animal, a bear maybe. But bears don't walk softly in circles just outside your tent. They crash. They sniff. These steps were almost human. I sat perfectly still, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, slow, measured, never breaking into a run. Every now and then, there was a pause and I could swear they were listening just like I was. I thought about the hatchet I had left by the tent's entrance. My hand itched to grab it, to have something to defend myself with, but I was terrified that the sound of movement from me reaching for it would alert whoever or whatever was outside. Time lost all meaning. The fire had almost died out, leaving just a few glowing embers. The darkness around me felt solid, pressing in from every side. I imagined shapes forming in the shadows, imagined hands reaching out, imagined being grabbed. My breathing became shallow. I forced myself to stay quiet, to not move, to not make a single sound. I realized that I had left my knife on the other side of the tent, too far to reach without risking detection. Every instinct screamed to run, to get to the car, to flee, but I was trapped, surrounded by trees, in the middle of nowhere. Finally, just as I was about to lose all hope, I heard something different. A low, quiet voice, not speaking words, just a mutter, almost a growl. I couldn't make out what it said, but it confirmed my fear. I wasn't alone. I didn't know if it was one person or more. Panic surged. My heart raced uncontrollably. I thought about trying to climb out of the tent and make a run for it, but then I realized the nearest road was miles away. I would never make it. Not in the dark. Not without being seen. Then came the sound of movement again. This time it was closer, scraping against the ground, deliberate. I held my breath, frozen in fear. I could hear a faint metallic clink, like a tool or a knife scraping against rock. My mind raced with every possible scenario. The safest thing was to stay still. Maybe they would leave if they thought the tent was empty. I didn't dare look outside. I just stayed low in my sleeping bag, clutching my knees, shaking with fear, my entire body tense, waiting. Hours passed like this. The footsteps circled, paused, then moved again. I didn't sleep, I didn't dare close my eyes. The fire had gone out completely, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear the forest breathing, the wind in the leaves, the occasional animal, but the sound of human movement kept returning, always nearby, always deliberate. At some point, I realized that I hadn't heard the footsteps in a while. My body was trembling, my nerves raw. I didn't dare move. I just waited, and then I heard it. A distant rustle, growing quieter as if someone had retreated, finally leaving the clearing. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just stayed huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that the danger had passed. I waited until dawn, when the forest was bathed in pale light, before I even dared to peek outside. My campsite was empty. Nothing had been touched, no sign of anyone or anything. The fire had turned to ash. My food was untouched, but the footprints around my tent were unmistakable, fresh, human, circling my clearing. Whoever had been out there, they had been watching me all night. I packed my things quickly, my hands still shaking. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't linger. I followed the trail back to the road, moving faster than I ever had, constantly scanning the trees, expecting to see movement, expecting to be followed. But nothing appeared. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted, trembling, and relieved. I locked the doors and didn't look back as I drove away. I never returned to that forest. The experience stayed with me for months. Every time I hiked elsewhere, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone hiding just out of sight. I became meticulous about safety, always telling someone where I was going, carrying extra protection, always having a plan to escape. The memory of that night taught me that fear in the wilderness doesn't need monsters or ghosts. Humans can be far scarier. Someone, for reasons I may never know, had deliberately stalked me through the forest, testing me, scaring me, and I had survived. I made it back alive, and that is the only thing that mattered. I learned the hard way that the forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable and full of people you can't always see. That night changed me. I became more cautious, more aware, but also more resilient. I realized that fear, when faced and endured, leaves you stronger. I never camped in complete isolation again, but I never lost my love for the outdoors. I just learned to respect it, and to respect the people who might be watching from the shadows. I had been planning the camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, away from the noise, away from people, and just be alone in the woods for a few days. I thought I knew what to expect. Quiet nights, the smell of pine, birds in the morning, the sound of a nearby creek. But I had no idea how wrong I would be about that. I drove for hours to reach the spot I had found on a map online. It was marked as a small camping area, barely used, deep in the forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The road had ended in a narrow dirt trail, which quickly narrowed into a path lined with thick brush. My car barely fit. I parked, took my backpack, and started walking into the forest. The air was different here, thick, slightly damp, with the smell of earth and leaves. I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a campsite. It was slightly elevated, so if it rained, water would run past rather than through. The ground was soft but firm enough for a tent. I began unpacking and setting up, spreading a tarp under my tent, staking it carefully, and organizing my gear. I had brought a lantern, matches, a stove, a cooler with food, plenty of water, and a small first aid kit. I wanted to be prepared for everything. As I worked, I noticed something. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Usually, even at the end of the day, a forest has some sound, a rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow. Here, everything was still. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the time of day. I built a small fire as the last rays of sun disappeared. I sat on a log, warming my hands and cooking a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The fire crackled, and the smoke rose straight up, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I ate slowly, listening for the sounds of the forest. When I heard nothing, I felt a subtle unease. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that I was completely alone in a place where no one came. Night fell fully, and the temperature dropped quickly. I zipped up my sleeping bag inside the tent, but the wind outside rattled the fabric. Then I heard it, a faint, crunching sound. It was slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. My heart rate increased. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe, but the sound was steady, not random. It moved closer, then paused. Then I heard another sound. A snap of a branch. I tried to calm myself, but my mind raced. I remembered the survival guide I had read. Stay calm, assess the situation, make noise to deter wildlife. I grabbed my flashlight, poked my head out of the tent, and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam caught nothing. The darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the circle of firelight. The noises stopped. I held my breath. I decided I would stay awake for a while, keeping the fire going. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. Every small noise made me tense. The wind in the trees, a distant owl, even the rustling of leaves from my own movement. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the forest was alive, and I was just noticing it now. But there was something different about this place. It felt alive in a way that was watchful. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost began forming on the grass near the fire. I was shivering, trying to stay warm. Then I heard it again, the slow, crunching steps moving closer. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. It stopped near the edge of the firelight, and I could see faint shapes moving in the darkness, too dark to identify. My heart was pounding. I grabbed the small hunting knife I had packed and held it tightly. Suddenly, the fire flickered, almost going out. I tried to add more wood, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped a piece. The sparks flew, and in that instant, I saw a large animal, a black bear, emerging from the shadows. Its eyes caught the firelight, reflecting a sharp, bright yellow. My body froze. It was bigger than I had imagined, standing on all fours, sniffing the air. I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself big. Speak in a calm voice. But the problem was, I was alone, and my fire was almost out. I slowly reached for more wood, tossing it onto the fire to keep it going, trying to make myself appear larger. The bear took a few steps toward me, sniffing, watching. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure it could hear it. Then something changed. The bear stopped, turned its head slightly, and walked away slowly into the trees. I didn't move until I was certain it was gone. I sat in the dark, staring at the fading firelight, feeling the cold settle into my bones. My body trembled not just from cold, but from fear. I realized that even a few moments of exposure to the bear could have been fatal if I had panicked. After what felt like forever, I managed to rebuild the fire, making it bigger this time. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fully alert, every sound causing my heart to jump. Dawn finally arrived, and with it, the light gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt since sunset. The forest now looked familiar again, even though it was still thick and imposing. I packed up quickly, careful not to make too much noise, but I kept scanning the edges of the clearing. I stuck to a narrow path on my way back to the car, keeping a stick in hand, moving cautiously. I didn't see the bear again, and I didn't stop until I reached the car. I collapsed in the seat, breathing heavily, shaking. The relief was overwhelming. I had survived a night alone in the forest, fully aware of the dangers around me. I drove home slowly, thinking about the entire experience. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also real and wild. Not like the pictures online or the camping brochures. Nature wasn't forgiving. It didn't care about my plans or my comfort. It simply existed, and I had to navigate it carefully if I wanted to survive. When I got home, I unpacked my gear, checking everything carefully. I realized that some of my food had been disturbed during the night. Likely the bear had been testing the area for a meal. It hit me that it hadn't attacked only because of chance, not because it was afraid. I had been lucky. That thought stayed with me for days afterward, a quiet reminder that respect for nature wasn't optional. In the following weeks, I went back to the forest, but only during the day, always on trails I knew and never alone. I learned how to read animal tracks, how to identify signs of predators, and how to keep a proper distance. I started carrying bear spray, extra water, and always left my itinerary with someone I trusted. The fear I had felt that night never fully left me, but it became a useful guide. I respected the forest, and in return, I survived. What I realized most clearly was this: fear wasn't something to overcome in the forest. It was something to respect. Told you where danger was, where to pause, where to act carefully. That night, I had listened just enough to survive. And even though the experience had been terrifying, it had also changed me. I became more cautious, more aware, more connected to the wild in a way I couldn't have imagined before. The memory of the black bear, standing there in the darkness, watching me, is something I will carry forever. But it is not a memory of panic or shame. It is a memory of survival, of awareness, and of learning that the forest, while frightening, is not an enemy. It is simply honest. It does not pretend. And if you respect it, if you stay alert, it lets you leave alive.